Our topic for this week is very important, lalong-lalo na when you already do your final project in experimental psychology lab. We are going to talk about ethical principles that you need to practice in experimental psychology. First things first, alamin muna natin ano bang ibig sabihin ng salitang ethics. Ethics is a sub-specialization under philosophy. So ano bang mga pinag-aaralan sa field of ethics? Basically, we talk about the do's and don'ts of certain fields of knowledge, no? So when we talk about ethics, pinag-aaralan natin dito yung mga bagay na dapat mong gawin at hindi dapat gawin at mga dahilan kung bakit natin dapat gawin o hindi dapat gawin yung mga certain behaviors in a certain field. In fact, ethics is a very big field of knowledge, no? Under siya ng philosophy, but under ethics, meron pa tayong bioethics, meron tayong marketing ethics, meron tayong medical ethics, so on and so forth. Did you know na meron din tayong sports ethics? Meron tayong mga do's and don'ts na ina-apply whenever people are playing a certain sport. Let's say for example, basketball, one of the ethics is kahit gaano katambak yung team na naglaro ng basketball, all members of the team must go to the center court and shake each other's hands. Kahit na naging violent yung game, kahit na maraming pisikalan sa game, it is ethical for players to acknowledge each other before they leave the court. Sa sport naman ng tennis, meron silang pinapractice na ethical standard where when a player is serving the ball, kinakailangan lahat ng audience tahimik. Bawal mag-boo, bawal mag-trash talk, unlike in basketball. Diba? When in basketball, when a person is doing free throw and you are not a fan of that person, pwede ka mag-trash talk, but not in tennis. In tennis, regardless whether you like the player or not, you need to keep quiet and give the player a chance to deliver a successful serve. Alam nyo ba kahit sa war, sa mga gera, nag-a-apply din tayo ng mga ethical standards. Like for example, two of the ethical standards I know in a war is number one, bawal kang pumatay ng isang kalaban na helpless na. So when you see a person who is already wounded, who is already defenseless, hindi na niya kayang depensahan pa yung sarili niya, it is ethical for a soldier not to kill that soldier kahit na kalaban pa niya yun. That is just the right thing to do. Another ethical standard during wars is, as much as possible, kapag merong mga babae o mga bata na nai-involve sa gera, dapat ini-spare yan. Hindi dapat pinapatay ang mga babae at mga bata. So these are some ethical standards that soldiers aim to apply every time that they go to a war. Now, we are going to talk about ethical standards this time na ina-apply sa psychological experiments. So, every time na gagawa tayo ng isang psychological experiment, tandaan na kinakailangan yung experiment mo ethical. Yes, you have a very clear independent variable. Klarong-klaro yung levels of IV. Klarong-klaro yung dependent variable mo, pati yung operational definition niya. Pero huwag niyong kakalimutan, another characteristic of a good psychological experiment is, it is ethical. Pero anong ibig sabihin ng ethical experiment? When do you say that an experiment is ethical, or what does it mean when an experimenter wants to be an ethical experimenter? Ang sagot dyan, when you want to be ethical in doing psychological experiments, we are preventing harm. Iniiwasan nating makasakit. Remember, in psychological experiments, most of the time, I think 99% of the time, yung mga participants sa pag-aaralan mo are human beings. And whenever human beings are involved in a psychological experiment, there is always a tendency na baka masaktan sila. And that is what something we don't like to happen. Ayaw nating nakakasakit ng ating mga participants in our psychological experiments. Kaya ko nga pinanood sa inyo yung pre-lecture videos of some of these unethical psychological experiments. Please lang, huwag nyo nang gagayahin, huwag nyo nang i-replicate. But let me give you two more examples of psychological experiments where people were hurt. Okay, like for example, etong Stanford Prison Experiment, obviously, yung mga sumali in that experiment were traumatized after the study. Diba? If you remember it right, Philip Zimbardo needed to stop the experiment somewhere towards the end. Actually, matagal pa dapat yung experiment, but Zimbardo has to stop it because people in the experiment became so violent against each other. Nagwelga na, nagrayot na yung mga guards against the prisoners. But to make the long story short, pagkatapos ng pag-aaral ni Philip Zimbardo, many of his participants were traumatized. And we understand why. 'Di ba? Kasi yung mga nangyari sa loob ng Stanford Prison Experiment, talaga namang nakakatrauma. Punong-puno ng aggression, punong-puno ng sadness, punong-puno ng mga different negative emotions that a lot of these participants were traumatized after the experiment. That's why a lot of psychologists are saying na napaka-unethical ng experiment ni Philip Zimbardo. Another example was the study done by John Watson kay Little Albert. Basically, ang gusto lang kasi patunayan ni John Watson is that yung fear daw o yung takot, hindi siya innate. It is not innate in us. Rather, yung takot daw ay kayang i-shape or kayang i-condition ng environment. It comes from outside. It comes from external stimulation. And to prove that, anong ginawa niya? Kinuha niya si Little Albert, who is so fond of the white rat. Hindi takot si Albert sa rat. In fact, he enjoys playing with the rat. So, Watson saw this as a perfect opportunity para patunayan na kaya niyang i-condition si Albert to be scared of the white rat that he loves. Kaya ang ginawa ni John Watson to do that, yung very popular na steel bar. So every time that Little Albert will play with the white rat, papatunugin ni John Watson yung steel bar behind Little Albert's head. So ang mangyayari, magugulat ngayon si Little Albert because of the sound. And John Watson will be doing that over and over again. Every time Little Albert plays with the rat, that sound will be played. At magugulat si Little Albert to the point, ano nangyari? Hindi na nilalapitan ni Little Albert yung white rat because he is already scared. Okay, another example, actually meron pang isang condition na ginamit sa John Watson na hindi masyadong sinasabi sa mga textbooks. Did you know? Meron ding condition si John Watson where he used a scary mask para takutin si Little Albert na makipaglaro doon sa white rat. Basically, John Watson wanted to associate the scary mask with playing with the white rat to the point na tuwing makikita ng Little Albert yung white rat, hindi na niya i-approach kasi natakot na siya. And John Watson again was very successful in conditioning Little Albert na matakot sa white rat. But even if he was successful, yung kanyang experiment is clearly unethical. It emotionally hurt Little Albert in that experiment. Kaya nga, ayaw na nating maulit itong mga studies na ito. So we are going to discuss today the ethical standards that you need to apply para hindi nyo pamarisan, hindi nyo gayahin yung mga experiments na napanood nyo. But before we continue, I know a lot of you will ask me, bakit po nakalusot yung mga ganong studies in the past? Well, it is because during those times, hindi pa ganon kahigpit yung mga organizations in psychology in policing whether an experiment is ethical or not. Hindi pa ganun kahigpit kasi yung standards natin doon. But as time goes by, as history goes forward, we are learning from our mistakes. What happened now is, we are now very strict pagdating sa ethical standards ng isang psychological experiment. Marami na ngayong mga nagpupulis na mga psychologists and organizations to make sure that all psychological experiments must be ethical. Halimbawa, nandyan ang APA, the American Psychological Association. Nandyan din ang PAP, the Psychological Association of the Philippines. Naglabas na sila ng mga written ethical standards that can be used as guides para yung mga researchers na gagawa ng experiment, ma-make sure nila that their experiment will be ethical. And by the way, I already uploaded the documents that I'm talking about. Those documents you are going to read this week para lang ma-orient kayo kung ano ba yung mga ethical standards that you need to apply in doing psychological experiments. Kasi hindi ko naman lahat madidiscuss in this lecture. So the rest, yung mga hindi ko madidiscuss in this lecture, you are going to read it on your own. So let's now talk about those ethical principles that we apply in experimental psychology. Basically, pwede mo namang hatiin yan into 3 categories. Meron tayong mga ethical principles that we apply for our human participants, for our animal participants, and for writing our experimental report. So let's first talk about mga ethical standards that we need to apply, especially when we are dealing with our human participants. Number 1, yung pinaka-basic, and I know a lot of you already knows this, the principle of informed consent. Sino ang nagbibigay ng informed consent? Is it the experimenter to the participants, or is it the participants to the experimenter? Ang tamang sagot dyan, it is the participants giving the experimenter the informed consent. So tatandaan nyo yan, no? Yung informed consent, nanggagaling yan sa participants. Binibigyan ng mga participants yung experimenter ng informed consent para magtuloy sa pag-aaral yung mga participants. So remember, this is the correct pattern in informed consent. Yung experimenter, magbibigay siya ng information sa mga participants. After the participants understand the information, then that's the time magbibigay sila ng consent. Ibig sabihin lang ng consent, dahil naintindihan nila yung information na binigay ng experimenter, pumapayag na sila na sumama doon sa experiment. Now, the question is, ano ba yung mga information na dapat binibigay ng isang experimenter sa kanyang mga participants? Ito yung mga bagay na yan. The participants must be informed of the following. Number 1, what the experiment is about. Kinakailangan malinaw na malinaw kung para saan yung experiment, kung ano ang topic ng experiment. Kung nakakaintindi yung participant, dapat i-explain mo rin kung ano ba yung IV, yung levels, at yung dependent variable. But as you can see on the screen, meron itong exception eh. Sometimes, kailangan nating ibahin yung number 1 to make the experiment successful. Yan yung tinatawag nating deception. In deception, ang ginagawa natin dyan is we are parang in a way changing what the detail on what the experiment is about para hindi maapektuhan yung performance ng ating participants in the experiment. Let's say, for example, my experiment is really about memory. Pero ayokong malaman nila na yung experiment ko tungkol sa memory, so ang gagawin ko, sasabihin ko sa kanila that my experiment is about personality. So yan yung exception. If you think that the performance of the participants will be affected kapag sinabi mo yung tunay na topic ng experiment, then you are justified to use deception. Pero meron ka pa rin gagawin later on when you use deception. Mamaya pag-uusapan natin yan. Number 2, the participants also has the right para malaman nila yung step-by-step procedure na gagamitin mo in your psychological experiment. Okay? So dapat step-by-step alam nila kung ano mangyayari sa kanila sa isang experiment. Alam nila kung ano yung IV, alam nila yung mga levels, so on and so forth. Pero again, just like number 1, meron ding exception yan. Kung sa tingin mo makakaapekto sa performance nila, kapag nalaman nila yung step-by-step procedure in the experiment, pwedeng hindi mo muna sabihin yan. Pero again, kapag ginawa mo yung mga exceptions na yan, meron kang gagawin mamaya after the experiment. Number 3, kinakailangan alam ng participants mo that they have the right to withdraw. Anytime during the experiment, biglang gusto nilang umayaw for any reason, pwede nilang gawin. At ang experimenter, hindi dapat pinipigilan yung participant not to withdraw from the experiment. Kasi may mga ganyang experimenters, di ba, yung parang pinupush pa yung participants to continue with the experiment even if the participant is no longer comfortable. Hindi pwede yan. Basta sinabi ng participant na ayaw na niya, the experimenter must let that participant go. Number 4, kinakailangan alam din ng mga participants kung meron bang mga possible risk in an experiment. Meron ba silang kakainin na medyo hindi maganda? Meron bang ipapakita na medyo disturbing? Meron bang mga ipapakita na may kinalaman sa mga sensitive topics? Dapat alam ng mga participants yan. Number 5, confidentiality. Obviously, dapat i-assure mo yung participant na yung performance niya in your experiment is very confidential. Ikaw lang ang makakaalam. Number 6, incentives. Kinakailangan alam ng participants kung magkano ba yung makukuha niya from joining your experiment. Or kung hindi man pera yung ibibigay mo, anong klaseng price or anong klaseng incentive yung matatanggap niya. At meron ako ditong please, no? Bakit please? Ibig sabihin ng please ko dyan, every time that you use human participants in your experiment, please, before you let them go, ipakita nyo naman sa kanila that you appreciate them by giving them a small token. Remember, these are human beings. Busy ang mga yan. But they have chosen to give a chunk of their time para makumpleto mo yung experiment mo. I think they deserve some credit for that. So, kahit papano, bigyan nyo ng kahit small price lang. Kung wala pang pera, okay lang. Pero, ipakita nyo lang sa mga participants nyo na na-appreciate nyo yung pagsama nila sa inyong experiment. And syempre, number 7, mahalaga rin na alam ng participants nyo yung contact number nyo. Lalong-lalo na ng head experimenter. So that in the future, if they have any questions or bigla silang merong naramdaman after the experiment, they know who to contact according to the ethical standards that we have. Kapag meron kang isang information dyan na hindi mo sinama o nalimutan mong sabihin, nagtuloy sa experiment yung participant mo na meron siyang hindi alam dyan sa 7 na yan, then automatically, you become unethical. One more thing about the principle of informed consent, kinakailangan written form yung informed consent. Dapat meron ka talagang hard copy of the information and then you explain those information to your participant and then after they understand everything ang gagawin nila, pipirma sila doon sa papel, patunay that they have understood everything you told them and they are now giving you their consent. Let me tell you a story na makakapagpatunay kung bakit mahalaga na dapat written form yung inyong informed consent at makuha nyo yung signature ng participants nyo. Once upon a time, merong isang grupo in a subject called psychological research. Hindi ako yung teacher, but I know who the teacher is. And these students that I'm talking about, mga dati ko itong estudyante. So to make the long story short, in that subject, they were asked to do a psychological research as their final project. So gusto nilang pag-aralan, itong grupo na sinasabi ko, yung mga tao who underwent a FUBU relationship. Alam nyo anong ibig sabihin ng FUBU relationship, no? Kung hindi nyo alam, i-research nyo kung anong ibig sabihin ng FUBU relationship. So, obviously, syempre, ang i-interviewin nila, by the way, yung method pala nila is interview, no? Naghanap sila ng mga participants na naka-experience ng isang FUBU relationship. So, meron sila mga guide questions and then yun yung mga questions na binigay nila doon sa kanilang mga participants. Anyway, before I continue, doon pa lang sa approval ng topic on the part of the teacher, sa tingin ko meron ng problema eh. Kasi yung pag-i-interview ng mga tao who underwent a FUBU relationship, medyo mabigat na topic yan that if you are not competent enough to handle the topic, hindi mo dapat topic yon in the first place. Pero inapprove nung teacher. Okay, so wala tayong magagawa doon, inapprove na, so they went on. So in fairness to them, nakahanap naman sila ng 10 participants who underwent a FUBU relationship. Now, there was this one participant who was triggered after ng interview. In fact, during the FUBU relationship nung participant na ito, no, naging traumatic pala kasi yung kanyang experience with the FUBU relationship. So eventually daw, at the first part of the relationship, FUBU lang daw talaga sila nung girl tsaka yung guy na ka-relationship niya, to the point na yung girl one day na fall in love doon sa guy. And when the guy learned that the girl is now falling for him, immediately terminate niya yung relationship. Hininto niya yung relationship, tapos yung girl talagang hindi na siya nagparamdam. And that was very traumatic for the girl that she suffered depression. Pero, after that, no, she saw a counselor, naging okay na siya, until, yun na nga, in-interview siya ng mga estudyante na sinasabi ko. And it all came back to her. Yung mga negative experiences niya in that relationship, biglang na, parang umangat na naman sa kanyang memory, at nakaramdam na naman siya ng symptoms of depression. Hindi na naman siya kumakain, hindi na naman niya nakikita yung point ng life niya, to the point hindi na naman siya nagpapapasok sa klase, bumalik na naman siya sa mga dati niyang mga bisyo. So, eventually, the symptoms return. The question is, sa tingin niyo ba, yung mga nag-interview doon sa babaeng yon, can they be liable for what happened? Well, my answer is, it depends. Do they have the informed consent? And by the way, itong babaeng pinag-uusapan natin ngayon, she's already in her legal age, no? So, hindi na kinakailangan ng parental consent. So, going back to those students, I asked them kung kumuha ba sila ng informed consent doon sa participant. And they told me, yes, they did. So, hiningi ko, nasaan na yung written form, yung form, yung mga papel na merong pirma ng participant, doon sila nagkamali. Kasi daw, yung informed consent na ginawa nila is through verbal agreement lang. Kumbaga, laway lang ang puhunan. No? Tinanong nila kung okay lang ba siya sumali sa interview. Sinabi naman daw nila yung mga guide questions na baka merong trauma na mangyari o bumalik yung trauma, at pumayag naman daw yung participant. It's just that hindi nila nakuha yung pirma nung participant. Doon sila malalagot. If, for example, the parents of this girl went to the court and sued the group, they can be liable. Kasi hihingin ng korte, so nasaan yung patunay that this girl understood everything and yet nagpatuloy pa rin siya sa experiment o sa interview. Wala silang maipakita, lagot sila sa korte. To make the long story short, buti na lang, hindi naman nagdemanda yung parents. Eventually, this girl saw a psychologist again, and eventually, she became well, and the rest is history. Pero muntik na. Kung nagkaroon ng demandahan, liable yung group, pati na sa tingin ko, yung teacher na nag-approve ng topic in the first place. So please, the principle of informed consent is very important to apply in doing your psychological experiment. Number 2, may tinatawag tayong principle of debriefing. Ito yung isang brief moment towards the end of the experiment. Ibig sabihin, bago lumabas ng experiment mo yung participant, dapat meron ka munang short time na kakausapin mo siya. Hindi yung natapos yung experiment, pinalabas mo na siya ng laboratory, no? So, you must still be speaking to the participant. And what are the things na pag-uusapan nyo in debriefing? Number 1, tatanungin mo kung meron ba siyang mga questions about the experiment that he or she went through. Meron kasing mga participants na talagang curious sila sa kanilang experiences inside your experiment. It's their right to be answered if they ask questions about your experiment. Kaya dapat kausapin sila bago sila lumabas ng laboratory. Number 2, dito mo na ngayon ipapakita o ipapaliwanag sa kanila na ikaw ay nag-deception. I-debrief mo sila. Sasabihin mo in debriefing na you deceived them in a certain way, but you also need to properly explain why you needed to do that. Kasi alam nyo, merong mga participants na babad trip kapag nalaman nilang gumamit ka ng deception. Kaya sa debriefing mo, dapat magaling kang magpaliwanag kung bakit mo kinakailangan silang i-deceive. Okay? Dapat magaling kang magpaliwanag dyan para hindi sila magalit. Pero may mga participants na gagalit. At bilang parusa sa inyo, no, na dineceive nyo sila, may mga participants sasabihin nila na ayaw nilang isama yung data nila in your study. And that's their right, by the way. Kapag sinabi nilang bad trip sila sa inyo dahil dineceive nyo sila at ayaw nilang isama sa inyong study yung kanilang data, that's their right. Maliwanag. Pero based on my experience, basta naman ipaliwanag mo ng maayos why you needed to do deception, most of the time they would understand. And number 3, syempre sa debriefing, dito ka rin magbibigay ng token of appreciation. Oh, sorry sa typo, no, na dalawa yung token, dapat isa lang yan. Token of appreciation. Ibig sabihin, sinabi ko nga kanina, whenever a human being spent time with you so that you can complete your experiment, and that time can no longer be returned, the least you could do is bigyan siya ng isang token of appreciation. Kahit mura lang, kahit hindi ganun ka-pricey, as long as you make your participants feel that you appreciate their time. Kaya nga before this pandemic, kapag dumaan ka sa psychological lab at mayroong mga grupo doon who are running experiments, talagang they make sure that they have treats. They have parang mga prizes or incentives, no, that they are going to give their participants as a token of their appreciation sa pagsama sa kanilang experiment. Number 3, pag-usapan natin yung principle of reversibility. In principle of reversibility, it is your responsibility to undo any harmful effects that you have given your participants. Kasi meron tayong mga independent variable minsan na yung isang level ng independent variable natin will require us to give something negative to our participants. Hindi naman talaga maiiwasan yan sa isang psychological experiment, no? But again, pwede mo namang gawin yun. It's just that you need to be ethical. Bigyan ko kayo ng 2 experiments that will show you, or 2 experiments that violated the principle of undoing, para mas maintindihan nyo kung ano ba yung principle of reversibility. The first experiment was the experiment by Carney Landis facial expression experiment. Simple lang naman yung tanong niya dito, no? Gusto niyang makita kung ano ba yung mga specific facial expression na pinapakita ng tao under certain emotions. So basically, he would like to quantify the movement of your face, the different parts of your face. He wants to quantify those different parts of your face para malaman niya if those parts of your face would move in a certain way given when you are feeling a certain emotion. 'Di ba? So pag-usapan natin yung procedure niya para makita niyo kung gaano to ka-unethical, no? First things first, drino niya o sinulatan niya ng linya yung muka ng kanyang mga participants. They needed to do this para ma-measure nila yung movement ng mga key points in the human face whenever it will express a certain emotion. So, dodrawingan yung mukha. Wala namang violation dyan. Wala namang ethical violation dyan, no? So, yun yung ginawa nila para makuha nila yung measurement of facial muscles. That's their dependent variable. Now, let's move on to the IB levels. Siyempre, doon sa IB levels, expectedly, ang gagawin nila dyan, they are going to induce certain emotions para makita nila kung paano ba yun magmamanifest doon sa muka ng kanilang mga participants. And what are these different emotions that they wanted to study? They wanted to study 3 emotions: disgust, sexual arousal, fear. So gusto nilang malaman kung meron bang certain way of facial movements na nangyayari whenever a human being experiences those emotions. So paano sila nag-induce ng disgust? Pinaamoy nila ng mabahong ammonia yung mga participants. Paano nila in-induce yung sexual arousal? Pinanood sila ng pornographic material in the laboratory. Paano nila in-induce yung fear? Pinilit nila yung participants nila na ilagay yung kanilang mga kamay in a bucket full of frogs para magkaroon sila ng facial expression of fear. And while the participants are expressing these emotions, pinipicturean ng mga experimenter yung kanilang mga muka so that they will be able to measure yun na nga, yung mga movements ng mga muka ng mga participants when they are now expressing those emotions. Pero alam nyo, hindi pa kompleto yung levels na binigay ko sa inyo, no? Meron silang isang level na talagang pinaka-controversial sa lahat. Meron silang IB level wherein they would like to know kung yung face ba ng mga participants will express or will move in a certain way when they are experiencing the combination of fear and disgust. At para makapag-induce sila ng fear and disgust, what did they do? They asked the participants to behead, pugutan ng ulo, yung isang daga. Now, most of the participants wouldn't like to do that. If that happened, anong ginawa ng mga experimenters? Sila mismo, yung puputol sa ulo ng daga sa harap ng mga participants. And you can only imagine what would you feel if you are in that situation. No? Totoo nga, fear and disgust. Now, it's very understandable after that experiment, marami talagang mga subjects ang na-traumatize. It's very understandable because they were exposed to this number of negative emotions. Maliwanag. So, this is a clear violation of the principle of reversibility. Kasi ang dapat ginawa dyan, if you are going to apply the principle of reversibility, meron kang gagawin sa mga participants mo para mawala yung mga negative emotions na naramdaman nila in the experiment. No? Dapat meron man lang counselor doon or psychologist doon para iproseso kung ano ba yung nangyari, so that the negative feelings that they have because of your experiment mawala sa kanila. That's what you mean by the principle of reversibility. Well, isa pang example of an experiment na violate ito, syempre, yung kay Philip Zimbardo. Kasi doon sa original experiment ni Philip Zimbardo, walang nakitang ganong katinding effort para i-reverse kung ano man yung mga naramdaman nila ng mga participants inside the Stanford prison experiment. If I'm not mistaken, parang ang ginawa lang dyan is right after the experiment, they were given the incentives and then that's it. Dapat man lang merong psychologist, merong counselor na kumausap doon sa mga participants na baka na trauma doon sa experiment ni Philip Zimbardo. So, these are some of the other things that you need to undo kapag ininduce mo in a psychological experiment. Stress, fear, disgust, pain, guilt, lahat ng pangit. Basta nag-induce ka ng mga negative emotions sa mga participants mo, responsibilidad mo to undo or to reverse those things that you have given your participants. Pero meron tong exception, no? Kapag yung binigay mo naman sa mga participants is something positive, halimbawa, pinasaya mo sila sa experiment mo, then hindi mo na kinakailangan i-reverse yan. Parang ang labas dito is you just give that to them. 'Di ba? Yung happiness na ininduce mo in your experiment, huwag mo nang bawiin. Okay na masaya sila na lumabas sa iyong experiment. Okay? So those are just some examples of the ethical principles that you need to follow in dealing with human participants. Yung ibang mga ethical principles on human participants, kayo na bahala magbasa in the documents that I already uploaded. Now let's move on to animals. Ano ba yung mga ethical principles that we apply or that we need to remember kapag ang pinag-aaralan natin ay mga animals? Okay? Kasi in psychology, meron din tayong mga paminsan-minsang mga pag-aaral where we try to study animals inside a laboratory. So kayo na lang bahala magbasa, maghanap kayo ng mga examples of psychological experiments that used animals. Pero isa sa mga pinakasikat na psychologist na talagang gumawa ng maraming animal experiment is none other than B.F. Skinner, isa sa mga fathers of behaviorism. So, ano bang mga pinag-aaralan niya about pigeons? Bakit siya nag-aaral ng mga pigeons? Ano yung naging contribution ng mga pigeons sa psychology? Well, kayo na lang bahala magbasa niyan. Alright? But this is a very important question to answer before I continue. If psychology is for humans, why experiment on animals? So, oo nga naman, di ba? Yung psychology para sa tao yan, bakit paminsan-minsan meron tayong mga experiments tungkol sa mga hayop? Especially, for example, in behaviorism, di ba? Yan yung mga common trend nila Mahilig silang mag-aral ng mga pigeons, dogs, rats, monkeys. Well, again, this is weird. If psychology is for humans, then why are we studying animals? Actually, to answer that question, pwede nating balikan yung sinulat ni John Watson sa The Behaviorist Manifesto. Diba? Kung naalala nyo, this is one of your readings one of the readings na dapat nabasa nyo as a psych major, di ba? Sabi nyo dito kasi, para sa mata ng isang behaviorist, walang pinagkaiba ang man sa animals. Basically, they are coming from that philosophy that if we want to understand the human mind, one way to do that is to understand the animal mind. Kasi yung animal mind at saka yung human mind, ano lang daw yan, no? Hindi raw siya magkalayo. Oo. Some other reasons why do we study or why do we experiment on animals, mas madali silang makuha, easy access. Hindi mo na kinakailangan magpa-schedule sa kanila kasi karamihan naman ng mga animals ay hindi busy. 'Di ba? Marami silang mga free time. So if you want to experiment on them, nagkalat lang sila dyan sa tabi-tabi. Number 2, the animal psyche is very much like the human psyche. Marami silang similarities. Ito na nga yung sinabi ko kanina. Kapag kukumpara mo daw yung functioning ng utak ng tao sa utak ng hayop, maraming pagkakapareho. Don't get me wrong, hindi ko sinasabing parehong-pareho, but there are many overlaps. Some examples of these overlaps include sexual behaviors, how people learn. Diba? Marami tayong mga learning principles na natutunan natin from studying the performances of animals inside a laboratory. Kaya nga sa laboratory ng psychology, very common yung mga mazes na yan where we are studying how rats, yung mga daga, paano nila napag-aaralan na isolve yung maze. By understanding how rats solve mazes, we are able to understand how human beings also solve their own problems. Number 3, why are we studying animals? Because let's face it, naging source kasi sila ng mga important psychological discoveries. Marami tayong mga nalaman about the human mind dahil sa pag-aaral natin sa mga hayop. One good example would be parts of the brain. 'Di ba? Ilang beses nang pinag-aralan ng mga tao yung parts of the brain ng mga animals. And how do they do that? By literally opening up their brains. Binubuksan yung skull ng mga animals and then pinag-aaralan ng mga psychologists yung mga brains nila, and then from there, they are getting discoveries that later on, they found out na totoo din when it comes to the human brain. Like for example, by studying the animal brain, we are able to discover na yung utak pala ng tao, just like the animals, is also specialized. Is also modular. The brain is modular. Ibig sabihin, there are certain parts of the brain specializing in certain functions. 'Di ba? Nagkaroon tayo ng hypothesis that our brain is like that. How? By studying the brains of animals. Kaya fast forward, because of these animal studies, now we know how modular the brain is. Certain parts of the brain is handling certain psychological functioning. Hindi natin malalaman yung ganyang model ng brain if the brains of the animals did not give us a clue in the first place. And last one, as we end, pag-uusapan naman natin ngayon yung mga ethical standards that you need to apply in writing your psychological experiment or in writing research in general. Ano ba yung mga ethical principles na yan kapag sinusulat mo na yung research mo o yung experiment mo? Lalong-lalo na kayo, in the future, kapag magsusulat na kayo ng experimental report, you need to remember these two things. Ano ba yung two common violations in reference to writing your research? Dalawa lang naman yan, plagiarism and forging. Yung plagiarism, this is the act of presenting another's work or ideas as your own. Sa Tagalog, parang sinasabi mo na yung idea na sinusulat mo in your paper, ikaw ang nakaisip nun. When in fact, nakita mo lang yon sa isang source. Kaya nga ito yung magandang expression ng plagiarism o yung kinaka-copy-paste mo lang straight from the internet and you are not citing the source where you got those ideas. Remember, ang assumption, kapag wala kang citation, meron kang sinabing idea doon, tapos wala kang citation, ibig sabihin nun, ikaw ang nakaisip nun. Now, magkakaroon ng problema kung yung idea na yon, wala kang citation, pero hindi pala sa'yo yun, then you have committed plagiarism. In fact, there are many ways how to express plagiarism. Like, for example, number 1, ito nga ay pinaka-common, hindi ka nagsasite. Number 2, nagka-copy-paste ka lang ng information. Beware, dahil ang Lasal, gumagamit na tayo ng software that is so powerful that it can detect students na nagka-copy-paste lang ng mga parts ng kanilang research paper. Yung tinatawag nating Turnitin. So please be careful, bago kayo mag-isip na magpe-plagiarize kayo, Lasal is very serious about this. Number 3, another expression of plagiarism is gumagamit ka ng data ng iba. Halimbawa, meron kang thesis topic, tinatamad kang mag-data gathering. Tamang-tama yung pinsan mo nag-aral sa isang university, in a different university, at nalaman mo na yung thesis niya, pareho kayo ng topic. Pareho kayo ng research question. So, ang ginawa mo na lang, kinuha mo na lang yung data niya, pinasend mo sa USB niya, tapos yung data na galing sa kanya, yun yung ginawa mo, yun yung ginamit mo to make your thesis appear as if nag-data gathering ka nga. Pero hindi naman talaga ang totoo, hiniram mo lang yung data sa iba, plagiarism din yan. And of course, number 4, another expression of plagiarism, yung nagnanakaw ka ng authorship. Madalas guilty dito yung mga teachers For example, 'di ba, in Lasal, merong mga thesis groups. Yung thesis groups na yon hinahandle ng isang teacher. Now, some teachers, not necessarily in Lasal, but basically in all universities, ang ginagawa, if they need to do a research, and by the way, most teachers need to do research para ma-promote. Biglang si ma'am, kailangan niyang ma-promote, kinakailangan niya makapag-publish ng research paper. That's one of the criteria para ma-promote. So, ang gagawin niya, ayusin na lang niya ng konti yung final paper nung kanyang mga mentees dati, and that paper, yan yung isasubmit niya para ma-publish. And by the time that it becomes published, pwede na ngayon siya magpa-promote. Violation yan. Because you literally stole, ninakaw mo yung thesis ng iyong mga mentees. Ang dapat ginawa ni ma'am doon, tinawagin niya muna yung kanyang mga dating estudyante, nagpaalam na gusto niyang ipapublish yung paper na yon. Ang mangyayari, magiging co-author lang si ma'am. Si ma'am magiging co-author lang, the main authors would still be the students. Paliwanag. Oo, so those are some examples of how plagiarism will be or can be applied in doing research. Pero wag niyong i-apply, Oo. And last one, let's move on to forging of data. Ano ba itong forging na ito? After plagiarism, now we have forging. This time, you are fabricating the data. Kumbaga dito sa picture, based on the picture, niluluto mo yung data. 'Di ba? Meron kang mga data na ginagalaw-galaw mo, you are fabricating it. Remember, in psychological research, specifically in experiments, ang principle natin is you leave your data as is. Kung ano yung nakuha mo, doon sa field, yun na yung data na dapat i-analyze mo. Wala kang idadagdag, wala kang ibabawas, leave the data as is. Oras na may ginalaw ka na kahit konti, dinagdagan mo o binawasan mo, you have already committed forgery. Let me give you one example of a research study na ginawan or nag-violate ng principle na ito, the case of the Piltdown man. One day, nagkaroon ng very big news ang scientific community because a group of scientists discovered a skull na kakaiba. Bakit kakaiba yung skull na ito? Because in England, 1912, they discovered a skull which is a combination of a modern human and an ape. Ibig sabihin, yung upper portion daw nung skull, pang tao, yung panga, yung lower portion nung skull, pang ape. Okay? So, half man, half ape. Ngayon, nung narinig ito ng mga scientist na meron pala talagang skull na half ape and half human, nagdiwang yung mga naniniwala sa evolution. So what happened was, for 40 years, because of this skull, okay, naging totoo, naging fact, naging scientific fact that humans were once upon a time apes. 'Di ba? Yun yung pinaniniwalaan ng mga evolutionists na nanggaling tayo sa ape, and then as time went by, pa-complex tayo ng pa-complex, naging human beings na tayo. So this skull is a testimony na there was a phase in our life where we are transitioning to becoming human. Kaya nga naiwan yung pangay. Unang naging tao yung upper portion, huling naging tao yung lower jaw. Pero ano nangyari? Hindi dyan natatapos ang storya, no? Na-invento ngayon yung carbon dating. As you know, carbon dating is a process where we do para malaman natin yung approximate age ng isang bagay. Yan yung pinaka ginagawa ng carbon dating. I-estimate mo yung age ng isang bagay. This is a perfect opportunity para malaman natin gaano nakatanda yung nakita nilang half man and half ape na skull. So that's what they did. They got the skull and then they put it through carbon dating. At ano ang kanilang na-discover doon sa skull when they applied carbon dating? Aba, hold on to your seats. They discovered that the upper skull was older than the jaw. Ibig sabihin nun, meron lang nag-attach ng skull na ito. Meron nag-attach ng upper part human being, lower part ape. To make it appear, it's a half man and half ape existence. Pero yun na nga, dahil sa carbon dating nakita nila na hindi pala totoo yan, it was fake, it was a hoax. In fact, kung talagang totoo yung skull na yan, regardless whether that's the upper portion or the lower portion, kinakailangan dapat pareho sila ng age. Pero hindi nga yun yung lumabas, no? Mas older pala yung upper skull kaysa sa jaw. Ibig sabihin, meron lang nagkabit nung bungo, no? ng upper part sa lower part to make it appear it's half man and half ape. So you can only imagine ano nangyari sa mga taong naniwala doon sa hindi tamang idea that humans came from the monkeys. Diba? Anyway, why would scientists or psychologists forge the data? Let me close here. Bakit ba sila magdadagdag o magbabawas ng mga data na makukuha nila sa field? The following are the reasons. Number one, for them to gain recognition. In science kasi, para mapansin ka ng scientific community, gumawa ka ng isang pag-aaral o ng isang discovery that is very controversial. For example, magpalabas ka ng isang study na ang sinasabi, Protestants are more sexually active than atheists. Di ba? So, medyo catchy yung result mo. And for you to get that result, ang pwede mong gawin dyan, dodoktorin mo yung mga data mo to make it appear that this conclusion is indeed true. Para lang magpasikat ka, para mapansin ka. So that's one of the reasons bakit ginagawa yan. Number two is to support a scientific theory, especially in psychology. Marami mga psychologists kasi, they are in support for a certain psychological theory. And for them to convince themselves and the public na tama yung theory na pinag-aaralan nila, minsan napipilitan silang mag-forge ng data. Yun na nga, going back to my example, yun yung nangyari sa Piltdown Man. Diba? Siguro, yung taong gumawa naniniwala siya sa evolution, and this person wanted also people to believe in evolution. Ang ginawa niya, finorge niya yung data. Finorge niya yung bungo. And last one, number 3, I think ito yung pinaka nag-a-apply sa mga students of experimental psychology lab is most students are tempted to forge the data because they would like to create an effect of IV on DV. Consider this study. Halimbawa, gusto mong malaman sa isang experiment kung meron bang epekto yung fear sa performance mo sa school. So in this case, the IV is the emotion of fear. The dependent variable yung gusto mong i-measure is their performance in school. So you have, let's say, 2 levels. Mga participants who have low levels of fear at mga participants with high levels of fear. And gusto mong malaman kung meron bang epekto yon sa kanilang grade. So you run the experiment and you found out, based on the slide, na mukhang walang significant difference. Whether you have low fear or you have high fear, yung grade mo pareho lang. Kasi kapag ganyan yung data mo, ibig sabihin, walang kinalaman yung fear sa dependent variable. Kumbaga, in statistical terms, ito yung tinatawag nating null hypothesis mo. 'Di ba? So, ang lumabas sa experiment mo is the null hypothesis. Walang epekto yung IV sa DV. Pero syempre, as the experimenter, you would always like to reject the null hypothesis at ma-retain yung alternative hypothesis. Ibig sabihin lang ng alternative hypothesis, gusto mong patunayan na yung sinasabi mong epekto ng IV sa DV talagang nag-e-exist nga. Yun, yung alternative hypothesis. No? Gusto mong patunayan na yung IV meron nga talagang epekto doon sa dependent variable. Pero yun na nga, going back to the slide, ang lumabas sa data, walang significant difference. Pareho silang average grade. Pero anong napansin mo? Bumalik ka doon sa data, doon sa in-encode mo sa Excel, nalaman mo na kapag nagpalit-palit ka ng mga numbers dyan, mangbabago ang iyong statistical analysis. Kapag may mga binago kang number dyan, by the way, in this slide, hypothetical lang to, no? This is not the data of the experiment I'm talking about. Just imagine that this is the Excel where nakalagay yung mga dependent variables nyo. Nalaman mo na konting galaw-galaw lang ng dependent variable, taasan mo yung isa, bawasan mo yung isa, magiging ganyan yung resulta. Can you imagine that? Kapag mababa ang fear mo, mas average yung grade mo. Pag mataas yung fear mo, mas mababa ang grade mo. So this would make it appear as if totoo ngang merong epekto yung fear sa iyong dependent variable. But then again, it will not become like this kung hindi mo siya dinoktor dito. So, karamihan, kaya natetempt, kaya nila gagalawin yan para nga ma-reject yung null hypothesis at ma-retain yung alternative hypothesis. Okay? Pero again, mali yun. Huwag niyong gagawin yun. Kung sinabi ng computer mo or ng statistika na walang epekto ang IV sa DV, that's it. Wala ka dapat gagalawin doon sa data. Wala ka dapat idadagdag. Wala ka dapat ibabawas doon sa data. Kung ano ang lumabas sa analysis ng statistika, then that's the analysis that you need to report. Remember, yung mga nakikinig sa akin ngayon, no, that your grade here in this subject does not depend on the effects. Huwag kayong ma-pressure in the future kapag gumagawa na kayo ng original experiment. Don't be pressured na magkaroon ng effect yung IV doon sa DV. Kung talagang walang epekto ang IV tsaka sa DV, walang problema. Because remember, having no effect, the IV having no effect on the DV is still knowledge. Huwag natin maliit yung null hypothesis. Hindi mo ikababagsak ang experimental psychology lab kapag hindi mo na-reject ang null hypothesis. Kung talagang walang epekto ang IV sa DV, then so be it. Wala talaga. It's still knowledge. Huwag kayong papadala sa pressure na dapat yung IV may epekto sa DV. Kung anong lumabas na resulta, yun na yun. Remember, yung mga mag-violate ng forging, ito yung mga parusa na pwedeng ibigay sa inyo. Number 1, pwede kang matanggal sa lasal niyan. Or automatic bagsak ka ng teacher mo. Number 2, kapag professional ka na, i-require ka mag-public apology. At ang matindi dito, the cancellation of license. Remember, in our society today, ang mga psychologists, ang mga psychometricians, may mga license yan. So, kapag napatunayan ka na nag-forge ka ng data, and you are a professional psychologist or a professional psychometrician, matatanggalan ka ng lisensya. At ang pinakamasakit sa lahat is mababan ka na from publishing your research. So, if you are working in the academe, you're a teacher, tapos na-forge ka, o nag-forge ka, nahuli ka, hindi ka na pwede mag-publish ng mga journal articles. And that's such a big thing kapag teacher ka, kasi yung pagpapublish mo ng journal articles, yan yung daan mo papunta sa promotion. Paano ka mapopromote? Kung ikaw ay nakaban from publishing. In the first place, baka tanggalin ka rin ng eskwelahan kung saan ka na nagtatrabaho because of the forging that you did. Okay? So, ang dami kong sinabi in this lecture. In fact, ang tagal na natin, mag-iisang oras na tayo dito, but there is just one takeaway that I would like to share with you regarding the practice of an ethical psychological experiment. Kung mapapansin ninyo, ang dami-dami pala natin dapat tandaan in making sure that our psychological experiment is ethical. And take note, hindi ko pa sinabi lahat. We don't have enough time for me to discuss everything, kaya nga in-upload ko rin yung mga ethical standards documents that you need to read on your own. Pero ito yung gusto kong take away nyo, Given the idea that psychological experiments are very strict when it comes to ethics, I hope you realize that in doing psychological experiments, we are applying dignity. Binibigyan natin ng respeto yung mga tao na sumasama sa ating pag-aaral. And since we practice dignity in psychological experiments, sana ma-realize nyo rin na meron din tayong dignity as psychologists, as psych students. Meron tayong certain level of respect na dapat minemaintain natin. Dapat natin yung dignity ng field natin, minemaintain natin yung dignity ng experimental psychology and psychology in general para irespeto tayo ng ibang professionals. Kasi ang business natin dito is we are in the process of finding the truth. We want to discover truth about how the mind works. But the thing is, merong presyo, merong price yung truth na yan. And the price of the truth is to run a study that is very ethical. In fact, kapag halimbawa nakadiscover ka ng truth in a psychological experiment, pero yung experiment mo is unethical, did you know? Ano mangyayari? Kahit gaano pa kaganda yung findings mo, because you have become unethical, the scientific community will not listen to your results. So, ibaban ka na ng scientific community, at the same time, hindi pa sila makikinig doon sa mga results na nakuha mo because your methodology was unethical. Ganyan ka seryoso ang mga psychologists in maintaining the dignity of our field. Na pinoprotektahan natin, nirerespeto natin, inaalagaan natin yung mga participants that are joining our experiments. So, I hope bilang mga estudyante ng experimental psychology, you are going to apply, you are going to support this effort that we are doing in maintaining the respect of other professionals to our field, psychology. And one way you can do that is huwag kayong gagawa ng mga experiments na unethical. Kasi kapag gumawa kayo ng mga ganyang violations, para nyo nang pinapahiya yung field natin sa iba pang mga fields. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time in our lecture video here in Experimental Psychology Laboratory. If you have any questions, you just comment down below, doon sa comment section natin. Okay? Thank you for listening, and God bless.